Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Celia Hatton, and today we're joined by our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale.
Hello.
Hi, James. It's great to have you with us. A lot to discuss. After the US and Iran failed to reach a deal in talks over the weekend, Donald Trump has said he's going to blockade all of Iran's ports from Monday. What would that even look like?
Well, essentially what it would be is an attempt by the United States to restrict the flow of largely oil and gas from Iranian ports through the Strait of Hormuz and out into the wider global economy. Because rather extraordinarily, throughout this conflict now, sort of into its sixth week, Iranian oil has continued to flow because although Iran has been blockading the strait for its opponents, it obviously hasn't been restricting its own traffic. So at the moment, Iranian tankers have been slipping out and going to their market. The Americans are attempting to try and resist that.
But it's not just the Strait of Hormuz that they want to block. They're saying all Iranian ports. So what are the logistics of all of this?
What that means, I think, in practice, and it's not entirely clear. We don't know. All we've got is the American Central Military Command saying, look, we are going to make sure that any vessel that is entering or leaving the blockaded area will, and I'm quote, be intercepted, diverted or captured. Now, what I think that means in practice is that American ships, warships, will sit offshore in the Gulf of Oman and elsewhere. They won't be going into the Gulf itself. They will be using their satellites and other techniques to watch Iranian ports, and any shipping, any tankers that come out of those ports will be monitored. They will be surveilled, to use the American expression. And once they come out, the Americans will then make a decision about whether they try to board and inspect and or potentially even seize that particular vessel. Seizing a vessel is not an easy thing to do under any circumstances. There are clearly military risks involved. Things can go wrong. People can get hurt. Then there's the legal issue about whether or not it is legal, because normally boarding another vessel is seen as an act of piracy. Now, obviously, there is a state of, you could argue a state of war between Iran and the United States, although there is a ceasefire at the moment. So there's that issue. Then there's the issue about what happens to the vessel after it has been boarded. Where does the United States and the authorities take that vessel? What do they do with the crew? What do they do with the oil or whatever the ship is carrying? So there are an awful lot of logistics. What's interesting is that the model used by other Western states against the Russian shadow fleet, where they are trying to deter these vessels in a similar way, it's very complicated. It's technical, and a lot of countries are quite cautious before doing this until they make sure they've got all the legal niceties, the military niceties, and the practical niceties lined up. So yes, it's not a simple procedure.
What is the strategy? I mean, they've been talking for weeks about trying to get Iran to open up the Strait of Hormuz, and now they're imposing their own blockade.
I think we should look at the context here. The context is of the talks between the United States and Iran face-to-face in Islamabad in Pakistan over the weekend, talks that did not produce the results that some hoped they might. And I think as a result of that, the United States clearly wished to put pressure on Iran and potentially also China, as an ally of Iran, a recipient of Iranian oil, to say, look, we want to put more pressure on you so that you come back to the table. Because at the moment, there is a gap between both sides. Both sides, both Iran and the United States, think that the other side is in a weaker and worse position than they actually are, which is one of the reasons why neither side is willing to accept any of the demands either side is making of one another. So what the Americans are trying to do is to change that calculus, to put pressure on the Iranians, both diplomatically and economically, to say, look, you can't outlast us. The problem is that thus far in this conflict and throughout much of recent history, whenever Iran is subject to political and economic pressure from an outside source, it tends to hunker down rather than make concessions.
It's interesting that you brought China into all of this. Can you explain that a little bit more? Why would the United States want to bring China in, and how would China be affected by this decision?
Iran listens to China. as do many countries around the world, particularly at the moment when US policy is increasingly inconsistent and erratic. Many countries around the world are looking to China in a way they haven't done before and saying, is it a different player? But specifically in this case, China is a supporter of Iran and consumes and purchases a substantial amount of Iranian oil. Now, China has an interest in this conflict ending, returning stability to the international market, not because it's wholly dependent on Iranian oil. It can find, energy from other sources, but China's economy is dependent on selling goods on the international market, and it needs to have an international market that is operating and not one that is subject to crisis, instability, excessive energy prices, and all the rest of it. So America would be hoping that by putting some pressure on Iran and also potentially a little bit of economic pressure on the Chinese can get a little bit more involved than they have been so far. There have been the Chinese have not been completely absent from this war. It had a meeting with Pakistan's ministers, and there was a joint Pakistan-China statement published after that, calling for an end to the conflict and things like that. But also, crucially, that statement calls for the strait to remain open. Mm-hmm. So I think that that will be the hope by the Americans. Whether it works is another question.
Yeah, could this backfire? Could we see a case where the United States Navy is in a case where they have to decide whether they're going to stop a Chinese tanker? How would that work?
Yeah, that'll be a tough question for the naval captain in charge of that particular vessel and the decisions that have to be made there. Yeah, because there's a huge difference between seizing and detaining an Iranian-linked vessel and actually trying to detain one that is, perhaps, flagged by in China, owned by the Chinese, because that's a very, very different question indeed. Whether or not the Americans are willing to take that military, potentially escalatory risk, again, is an open question about this blockade.
What could this do to oil prices, do you think?
Well, oil prices have already surged as a result of the announcement of this blockade. And clearly, if there is less oil leaving the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf, then clearly oil traders will act accordingly on that basis. At the moment, as ever, as we've seen throughout this conflict, the oil price has gone up and down depending on the optimism or the pessimism of the traders in the market. If they think that this blockade is not just an attempt to pressure Iran, and it's not just a diplomatic play, and it actually is something that might bed in, become semi-permanent and sort of become part of the status quo, then I think the likelihood is that it could have a long-term serious pressure on the oil price to rise even further than it is already.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of the risks involved in this strategy. But what if it goes right from a U.S. point of view? What effect could this American blockade have on Iran, on Tehran?
Well, we saw earlier this year there were protests in Tehran, prompted not just out of opposition to the regime, but primarily, initially at least, because of economic concerns. That pressure could build. Iran's economy is in a very parlous state at the moment, and any further pressure could potentially lead to those political pressures rising again on the government there, people coming out on the streets and saying, look, we got a ceasefire, that's great, we're not getting bombed by the Americans and the Israelis anymore, but at the same time there's no bread, inflation is soaring, we can't get any fuel, we need to do something about this. That's what the Americans will be hoping for. I've only ever been to Iran once, and when I was there, the thing that impressed me most, that I remember most, was just how many people I spoke to said, at a time when there were sanctions and people were talking about economic pressure, many people there reminded me of the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. And they said, things were really bad then. We survived that. We can survive this. And I think that is a sentiment that I've seen and heard and read has echoed in recent weeks as well.
Is this blockade really also about optics, about the United States looking strong, from moving away from a position where they're ordering Iran to do something that they didn't want to do, to being the ones to say, okay, now we're the ones imposing the blockade. You have to get past us now. How much of it is about that?
Politicians down the ages always like to pull a lever. They like something to be done. So yes, this is an American response to, as I said, the weekend's lack of progress. So they want to get on the front foot, to take the initiative, to try and disrupt thinking within in Tehran, so that people start thinking, crikey, can we survive that? How can we deal with this? So when you're in that kind of negotiation, to that extent, it makes sense to do something that just changes the status quo. But ultimately, even if it shows the Americans are doing something, they actually have to do it. If this blockade continues, it's highly likely at some point a vessel will be captured and seized, and we'll have lots of pictures put out by the Americans. But it's equally possible that a ship gets through. Very few blockades are absolute, and then a vessel will get through. And I'm sure the Iranians will take great pleasure in demonstrating that to the world themselves, because, as you say, a lot of this is about optics. But primarily at the moment, this is about America trying to put pressure on Tehran, and we'll see whether it works.
Thanks, James. Our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale. And if you'd like to hear more from the Global News Podcast, click the link below. Thanks for watching.